I will take a moment before I turn to anyone else to acknowledge a tragedy that occurred over the weekend in Buffalo. As we know, there was a massacre that occurred, as is far too often the case in our country. We had yet another mass murder, this time 10 victims who appear to have been targeted for being nothing other than members of the Black community who were conducting their lives in America. If nothing else, I just don't want to pretend like it didn't happen, and don't want to be part of the ongoing process where we in this country normalize something that should not be normal. If we can take a moment in silence to recognize not just the victims, but their families and everyone else who's been impacted by the massacre. We'll take a moment now. Thank you. With that, we have any additional council member comments, or we'll also allow for the mayor, city attorney, or IBA. Council member Von Wilpert.
Thank you, Council President. I was actually going to take a moment to talk about the mass shootings over the weekend too, and the fact that we opened this chamber this morning with a moment of silence for the 1 million American lives we lost to COVID over the weekend, and now we have another moment of silence for the 10 victims and their families in the shooting in Buffalo. Then we had a second mass shooting in Laguna Hills over the weekend, and so I just want to take the time to also highlight that there's things we can do about this. You know, we here in San Diego passed the first ghost gun ban in the state of California, and we got our first conviction under that law only about 10 days ago. Since we passed the Enough ordinance, Los Angeles, San Jose, San Francisco, Oakland have also passed similar laws restricting unregulated guns. The Biden administration has taken this national and is posing a law to make sure every part of a firearm is regulated as a firearm. And in just these past 2 weeks, our very own city attorney's office has removed guns from multiple dangerous situations using our gun violence restraining order program. One of them was an individual who threatened to commit a shooting at one of our local universities. That man no longer has a gun. Another person was someone who voluntarily surrendered his firearms after stating that he was worried he might, quote, do something he would regret to his coworkers. That man no longer has a gun in San Diego. The third was a man who dropped a handgun while threatening to commit suicide, which was picked up and hidden temporarily by the man's 12-year-old son before recovered by law enforcement. That man no longer has a gun in San Diego because of the work we're doing to try and prevent gun violence. But we need the public to help. If you see something, say something. If you have a coworker or someone in your congregation or a family member who is experiencing mental health issues or anger and makes threats about their workplace, their place of worship, themselves or others, please call the city attorney's office or the police department so we can intervene and get a gun violence restraining order put in place to prevent these things from happening here in San Diego. So thank you, Council President. I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Councilor Von Wilpert. Seeing no additional requests to speak, I will thank you, Councilor Von Wilpert, again for that. Not to belabor the point, but I also think it's worth noting the way the New York Times began this description of what happened. The racist slaughter at a Buffalo grocery store on Saturday is the latest episode in a troubling rise of violence against African Americans built upon historic racial fault lines and a polarized social climate. In 2020, a year marked by the triple forces of the coronavirus pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, and the social justice movement protesting police violence and racism, the FBI reported a surge in hate crimes targeting African Americans. About 64.9% of the 8,052 reported hate crimes incidents that year were based on race, ethnicity, or ancestry bias, according to the FBI. Within that category, Black Americans made up more than half of the victims. The number of reported hate crimes against African Americans in 2020 was 2,871, up from 1,972 in 2019. That spike drove a nearly 9.1% increase in hate crimes overall. In the 5 years before 2019, African Americans were victims in about half of all the race, ethnicity, or ancestry bias cases, according to FBI data. So no doubt, we have an epidemic of gun violence. We also have an epidemic of white supremacy that hopefully this can be a catalyst for some change toward.